Hello and welcome back to the channel where once again it's time for another First Impressions video, a series where I take a look at a game that I've never played before and then summarize my initial thoughts on the game after playing it for around about 60 to 90 minutes. Today we're taking a look at a multi-format game that came out in 1999. I am, of course, talking about the game known as Shadowman, which originally saw release on the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation in August of that year, before coming out on the Dreamcast several months later in December.
Without exception, when they die. Michael Leroy is the current heir to the mysteries of this ancient lineage.
Now, the story for Shadowman has its origins based in the year 1888. Jack the Ripper, who's lamenting the fact that his ritualistic murders have not unlocked a mystical power that he believes exists, prepares to perform the ritual upon himself at the expense of his own life. A man named Legion appears and tells Jack that the power he seeks does exist, and he offers to share this power with him if Jack constructs an asylum for like-minded killers in Deadside, which is the land of the dead. Proclaiming, "For we are many," Jack commits suicide. Now, in the present day, Michael Leroy becomes the current Shadowman, which is a lineage of voodoo warriors who protect the world of the living from threats crossing over from Deadside. After the voodoo princess Nettie bonds the Mask of Shadows to him, Nettie has a prophetic dream that Legion is preparing to usher in the apocalypse by claiming all of the dark souls, which are the immortal souls of damned warriors, and he's going to use them to create an immortal army and send it over into the land of the living. Now, Nettie reveals that Michael cannot stop the Five, a group of serial killers recruited by Legion, without his powers. The Five, who each have a dark soul within them, are hiding in the land of the living, where Michael's powers do not work during the day. Michael travels to the dark side with the use of his dead brother's teddy bear, and this serves as a link between both worlds.
I must stop this evil from bringing about the end of all things.
Only you can do it, Shadowman. You are the walker between the worlds.
So once you hit the main menu, you'll see you've got a choice of New Adventure, Restore Adventure, Options, Secrets, and reviewing the movies that you see within the game too. Once you go into Options, you've got a few sound settings that you can change. You can check the control pad configuration, and you can change the display settings if you're playing the game on a CRT. For the sake of the video though, I am playing in VGA mode.
Just a pawn in Nettie's master plan. She moves me in mysterious ways, and brother, sometimes she really does move me.
So like always, I'm going to start with visuals first, and the first thing that I thought when I saw Shadowman running was that it simply looks like a clearer, sharper version of a PlayStation 1 game, and the graphical presentation I felt was pretty disappointing. You can tell this was not designed for the Dreamcast at all, and it's games like this which would have made some people think at the time, oh, the Dreamcast isn't really worth getting because it only looks a little bit better than what I can play on the N64 and the PlayStation. And if you're familiar with the Dreamcast and the amount of quality looking games that came out on the system, you'll know that's completely false. We saw amazing games on there, Soul Calibur, the Shenmue games that looked absolutely incredible, and the character models on Shadowman are pretty unimpressive. I have to be honest, there isn't really anything impressive about them whatsoever. Obviously, the game runs in a much better resolution than the PlayStation game, for example, and it runs at a much better frame rate than both the PlayStation and the N64 games as well. Obviously, I hadn't played either of those games either, and I actually played them for a little bit after playing this, and I've got some footage of both of those games that I will show you in a little bit. But overall, I just felt the quality of the visuals wasn't particularly impressive. Now, in terms of the atmosphere that the game creates with the graphical presentation, I think that is very, very good. It's dark, it's dreary, it's exactly what you would expect from a game where there's an evil force building and they want to take over the land of the living. I think it pulls that off very, very well. There are a couple of things, though, that I want to point out with the performance of Shadowman on the Dreamcast. Occasionally, the game will almost freeze for like a millisecond as it seems to be loading when you're moving around an area. And I don't understand this because when I played the PlayStation and the N64 versions after, neither of these versions had this. And it's bizarre because the Dreamcast was vastly more powerful than than both the PS1 and the N64, and there isn't really any excuse for this happening. Another thing to point out is that the Dreamcast version of this game has terribly long loading times. I just could not believe how long it took for each section to load on this game. When you consider it's not an incredible looking Dreamcast game, for it to take as long to load as it did, I was actually quite disappointed. The graphics engine is actually pretty solid. It isn't really glitchy or anything, and it does perform very well in that regard, vastly superior to the PlayStation version, which is full of glitches. Now obviously I only played the game for just over an hour, so I didn't really see that many areas, so I couldn't tell you if the game gets more varied in terms of the presentation and whether there's some lighter, perhaps less dull areas than I saw in the start of the game, because they are fairly similar from what I've experienced so far. I think the game is actually quite a big game, to be fair, much larger actually in sort of scope than I originally thought, and I actually think it would take quite a long time to play through this game, so it might take quite a while before you start seeing perhaps more varied enemies and more varied locations as well. But overall, I do feel that visual quality for Shadowman on the Dreamcast is actually quite disappointing. What I'm going to do though now is play you some footage from both the PlayStation 1 and the Nintendo 64 version, so you can actually get a little bit of an idea how all three versions compare.
Hey there, Mike. Glad you could make it.
How could I refuse your offer? How could I ever refuse you, Agneta?
You can't. I'm simply irresistible. Hey there, Mike. Glad you could make it.
How could I refuse your offer? How could I ever refuse you, Agneta?
You can't. I'm simply irresistible.
Now moving on to the sound effects and music, and it's actually quite difficult to talk about Shadowman when I've only played it for around about an hour, because I don't really feel like I've experienced enough of what it potentially has to offer in this area. Obviously the game's fully voice acted, and that's a draw, that's a good thing, especially when it's actually done well. I feel voice acting in games does add a certain feel to a game and gives it that little bit more of a realistic and immersive experience, is probably the best way to describe it. And Shadowman does that quite well. In terms of the music, when it does play, it is quite atmospheric, and I do feel it kind of draws you in, and it's got this foreboding feel to it, although I haven't heard that many tracks so far. A problem with the Dreamcast version is, at least, I don't know if it's like it on the PlayStation and the N64, is you can be going through an area with music playing, and then all of a sudden it stops, but it doesn't seem like it should have stopped there, and that's a little bit irritating. I don't know whether it's intended to be like that, because it just seems a little bit odd. I understand it if you're changing location, but when all of a sudden it just stops for no apparent reason, it does seem a little bit strange, if I'm being honest. In terms of the sound effects, I think they're okay as well. I haven't really heard anything that's terrible. One thing I will point out is the fact the sound of his gun probably will start to grate on you when you're running around gunning down enemies over and over again. That did start to sort of get on my nerves just a little bit. The screams from the bad guys all sound okay as well. I just think overall it's probably quite difficult for me to give it a really good assessment based on just 1 hour of gameplay. But like always, I will give you some samples of some of the music that I've experienced so far within Shadowman. Now, moving on to the gameplay next, and it's actually quite hard for me to talk about this because I feel Shadowman's the kind of game that's going to need quite a lot of time put into it before you experience everything that the game has to offer. In terms of the basic premise, it's a 3D action-adventure game, which in all fairness controls very similar to the Tomb Raider games. Shadowman can run, jump, he can pull himself up ledges, he can do forward rolls, he can strafe, and he can, of course, use his guns to shoot down all of the enemies. In that regard, it's actually a very traditional 3D adventure game for the time period. Now, the game's split up into two worlds, the live side, the land of the living, and of course the dark side, the land of the dead. And Mike, as he's known in the land of the living, can transfer between both of the worlds by using his teddy bear item, and this is integral to progressing through the game. It's worth pointing out that if Mike dies in the land of the living, he's then transported over to the dark side, and of course if you want to go back to the land of the living, you need to use your teddy bear item. And when you couple this with the fact that the game has actually got very long loading times, it can actually be a little bit frustrating to play. Something else I found out that was a bit irritating was that, certainly near the start of the game at least, Mike/Shadowman, he dies very easily. He doesn't have a lot of health, and he actually can't hold his breath under the water very long when he's in his human form. In fact, I found this actually very frustrating because I kept running out of oxygen when I was in the water, dying, traveling over to the dark side, then needing to use the teddy bear item to go back to the land of the living, and this actually got quite tiresome. The objective of the game revolves around Shadowman collecting all of the Dark Souls to increase his power so that he can take down Legion and stop him invading Liveside. Now, the inventory screen actually has quite a lot of spaces, so I'm assuming there are a lot of items to collect within the game. Obviously, it's actually a fairly big game, I think, so I didn't really experience collecting many items during my time with the game. There are several weapons that you can get in the game, and there's other items such as life force, energy, skulls, Kadux, and all of the ammunition for his weapons as well that can help you on your way. There are actually also a fair amount of files to read as well in the game, which actually give you quite a lot of background information on all of the enemies. And if you really want to experience the game, I feel like you're going to have to put yourself through reading all of these. Now, in terms of actually how good does it play, it's fairly difficult for me to say that it feels innovative or exciting from my first impressions. To me, it just feels like a fairly run-of-the-mill action game in the way that it plays, and it doesn't really bring anything new to the table. So moving on to content and lifespan, it's very difficult for me to actually talk about this because I've only experienced a very small part of the game, and research tells me that Shadowman takes around about 15 hours to play through if you're not doing every nook and cranny of it. If you choose to do that, it may well take over 20 hours to play, so the game definitely seems to be a pretty lengthy adventure, to be fair. Now, it's not the kind of game I think that you're going to play again once you've completed it, but again, that's just my opinion. But it definitely seems like the adventure itself is actually quite substantial. So like always, that leaves me with my two final questions. Is Shadowman on the Dreamcast a game I'm going to come back to and play more of and potentially finish? And what final grade am I going to give it? Now, in terms of revisiting this game, I would say it's very, very unlikely because I just didn't really get that interested in the game. I wasn't particularly gripped by the story, and the way it plays, it just didn't feel like anything special. So I don't really think I'm going to ever play it again, if I'm being honest. In terms of a final grade, if I was just talking about this as an N64 game and it hadn't been released on the Dreamcast, I think I'd actually be slightly more positive. I think it would probably give it a decent B grade, because I think as an N64 game, it would actually be quite impressive overall, especially if when you're playing it with the expansion pack, it actually maintains its frame rate. I don't know if it does because I don't have an expansion pack currently for my N64, but many people will know when you play N64 games with an expansion pack in, they might look better, but a lot of the time they run at half the frame rate. So I wouldn't actually be optimistic about Shadowman being better really in high res. But of course, we're talking about the Dreamcast version, and it really is just a slightly sharper, better looking, better running version of the PlayStation and the N64 game, and it just doesn't do enough for me. It's not particularly impressive when you're looking at it against other games that were designed for the Dreamcast and came out just on the Dreamcast, rather than games that were sort of upscaled from the PS1 or the N64 to the Dreamcast, like Shadowman. So the final grade for Shadowman is a not particularly impressive D grade. I really don't think they did enough here to even warrant putting it on the Dreamcast, in all fairness. But of course, these are just my thoughts and my thoughts alone. I'm always interested in hearing what everybody else has to say about these games. So let me know if you had Shadowman on the Dreamcast or the N64 or the PlayStation, and let me know what you think of it down below. Like always, I'll be back in the near future with another First Impressions video. Goodbye for now.